Hi, welcome to Unit 2, Lesson 1, where we're going to learn some chords. This is what you've been waiting for. So the first thing we want to do is introduce the four primary chords, which are in the book, and they're nice close-up pictures, but I'll just play them for you so you hear what they sound like. G is the one chord in the key of G. C is the four chord in the key of G. And then D is the 5 chord, and D7 is what we call the 5-7 chord, and they're actually considered the primary chords in the key of G. I want to talk mainly about moving between these. There's a couple things we should clarify about the names. You can either say G or you could say G major. It's the same thing. But usually we just are kind of a little more casual and say G. That's one thing. The other thing is there is some discussion of Roman numerals representing the chords in the key. So when we talk about instead of calling it G, when we call it the one chord in the key, we'll use a Roman numeral, and it'll be an uppercase Roman numeral to represent a major chord. And so similarly on C, where it's the 4 chord, we'll use an uppercase Roman numeral 4. And D, we'll use an uppercase Roman numeral 5. And for D7, it's still considered a 5 chord. We just add a little 7 behind it. It's called the 5-7 chord. And the 7 will actually be in Arabic numbers, but the 5 will still be in the Roman numerals, because it's really just a variation of the D chord. Okay, so you're going to learn the standard fingerings. There are some challenge and easier fingerings on the website. Basically, the G chord would be just with one finger, the C chord would be with one finger, and the D chord would, as it is in the simplified versions. In the challenge versions, we use bar chords, and so for those of you who have played guitar before, you might be interested in the challenge fingerings. Okay, really what I want to talk about is this concept of catch and release, because that's hard to articulate in the book, and it's really important for getting your fingers together. So when you learn the chords at first, you're going to struggle looking at the book. You're going to say, okay, I'm going to play G chords. So I'm going to put my first finger here. Then I'm going to put my second finger here. And then I'm going to look at the book and put my third finger here. What would be nice is if you only did that once. And then what you want to do is keep your fingers in position. And we're going to not even take our fingers off the strings. We're just going to relax our fingers. I don't know if you can see it on the video, but I think you can. And I'm just relaxing. I'm not removing my fingers from the strings. So I'm going to press the strings down and strum. Relax, press my fingers down and strum. And at first you might want to just take stock of the chord and make sure that you're getting each note sounding clearly. And then we'll do some catch and release. And literally, I'm talking like do this 100 times. And so if I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm releasing between every strum. It doesn't take that long. What we're doing here is we're developing muscle memory. And while you do this, you want to try and be aware of how it feels with all those fingers dropping down at once. We want to get the sensation in our hands. So I want you to be very physically aware as you do this, how it feels. And as you do this, you may get some of this kind of sound. And that's okay. Fake it till you make it. Straighten them back out, get the note sounding good, and then catch and release. Then if you're feeling a little more confident, you can take your fingers slightly off the strings and place them all down at once. Notice that I'm not doing this. There's not Star Wars effects here. We're keeping close to the strings. And this is what we'll talk about in a minute, which is economy of motion, which is we don't want to move our fingers any more than we have to. So then I'm going to do the same idea with C. And again, you'll probably put your fingers down one at a time. And so we'd like to minimize how often we do that and maximize how often we push them all down at once. This will really facilitate changing chords, and I'll show you why in a minute. So you're going to do this with each of the 4 chords. Catch and release is what we call this idea. And remember, don't remove your fingers at first. Just relax your hand and push all together. Simultaneous fingers coming down. Okay, now I want to talk to you a little bit about the idea of economy of motion. So the hardest part, first just memorizing the chord shapes will be difficult. And so you're going to have to work on that for a while. But eventually you're going to want to play the songs. And so then we have to think about how do we move from G to C. And the first thing I want you to notice is that all my fingers are moving at once. So this is what we want to avoid, is when we go to change, putting one finger down. We don't want to do that. We want to go like this. So this is why the catch and release thing was setting you up to hopefully allow those fingers to drop down all at once. And so I'll give you some ideas about economy of motion. So one thing is to think about each finger motion. So I'm going to go from G to C, and I'm going to talk about what I'm thinking about as I do this. So first of all, I'm noticing that my third finger is going to stay on the same fret between G and C. So when I'm moving, watch that third finger, it just goes straight down to where it needs to be. And it's got to travel a long distance. So it's going to move a little faster maybe than the other fingers. My second finger here is moving one fret back and two strings over. So watch that finger. So that's a pretty close by move. My first finger is having to travel from the second fret to the first fret on the second string. So it's making a pretty good motion. But the one thing I also notice about this is that the orientation of my first and second fingers is very similar when I go to C. It just has a string between them. So you might want to try and move those together as a unit. And so when I do the whole thing, all those ideas are coming together. And similarly, when I go back, I'm thinking in reverse. Now, if I'm going from C to D7, I want to show you a little trick, because some people find D7 a little easier because you can leave your second finger, or your first finger, on the second string and just pivot to D7. So that's a nice, and the second finger is just moving over one string. So your third finger is having to do some traveling. And then when you go from D7 back to G, think about sliding this third finger on the first string, and I call this riding the rail. We're going to ride the rail and let those two fingers, which are in the same orientation from the D7, they're just over quite a few strings, but they're in adjacent strings, and they're one fret apart, and same thing here. So from D7, you can ride the rail back to G. If you're going to D, it's a little harder because all your fingers have to make pretty complicated moves, except that your third finger is going to stay on the same fret at least, from C to D. Your second finger is also staying on the same fret, but it's moving quite a few strings. So just this idea of economy of motion, what we don't want to do is this. This is what we don't want to do, is when you're going from G, take your fingers off and then put them down. And then when we go to D, take them all off. This is not going to help us in any way. And so so the good news about practicing is every time you practice, you learn. The bad news about practicing is every time you practice, you learn, which means you want to be careful to practice correctly so that you develop the muscle memory of dropping all at once. Be a little patient. All right. We will see you at lesson 2, unit 2, in just a minute.